Hey guys! Tonight we're setting sail into one of history's most romanticized yet brutal realities: life aboard a medieval ship. We've all seen the movies: brave sailors conquering the high seas, adventure on every horizon, the freedom of the open ocean. But let me tell you, the reality of medieval maritime life would have you begging to be thrown overboard by breakfast time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But fair warning, by the end of this, you'll never look at a cruise ship the same way again. Congratulations! You've just been pressed into service aboard a medieval cog, bound for Flanders with a cargo hold full of wool and your stomach full of regret. The year is 1347, and you're about to discover why the phrase "between the devil and the deep blue sea" wasn't just colorful maritime poetry. It was a daily choice between equally horrible fates. Your recruitment wasn't exactly voluntary.
Maybe.
You were drunk in a tavern when the press gang found you. Maybe you owed money to the wrong people. Or perhaps you were just unlucky enough to be walking near the docks when the ship's captain needed to replace the 3 crew members who died of dysentery on the last voyage. Either way, you're here now, and there's no going back. Your new home is a wooden vessel, roughly 80 feet long and 20 feet wide. Smaller than most modern suburban houses, yet somehow expected to house 30 to 40 men for months at a time. The ship creaks, groans, and flexes with every wave like a living thing in constant pain. And the smell, the smell hits you before you even step aboard. It's a cocktail of human waste, rotting fish, tar, moldy wood, and something unidentifiable that might once have been food. The captain, if you're lucky enough to catch a glimpse of him, looks like he's been carved from the same weathered oak as his ship. His face is burnt leather, his hands are gnarled claws, and his eyes hold the hollow stare of a man who's seen too many storms and buried too many crew members at sea. He barely acknowledges your existence to him. You're just another replaceable part in his floating machine. Your fellow crew members aren't much more welcoming. These are hard men, made harder by the sea. They've got scars from rope burns, missing fingers from rigging accidents, and teeth blackened by scurvy, if they have teeth at all. They look at you with a mixture of pity and amusement. They know what you're about to go through, and they know most new. Crew members don't last long enough to see their first port. The ship's hierarchy is brutal and absolute. At the top sits the captain, master of life and death. Below him, the master mariner, who actually knows how to navigate. Then the bosun, who manages the crew with a combination of shouting and violence. Next come the able seamen men, who've survived long enough to actually know what they're doing. And at the very bottom, there's you, the ship's boy or ordinary seaman, expected to do the most dangerous work for the least food and no respect whatsoever: your quarters, if you can call them that, are in the forecastle, the front part of the app. Ship that takes the worst beating from every wave. There's no cabin, no bunk, not even a hammock. You sleep on the bare wooden deck, maybe with a thin blanket if you're extraordinarily fortunate, more likely wrapped in whatever clothes you have. The deck is never dry, never warm, and never clean. It's slick with seawater, grease, and things you'd rather not identify. Privacy doesn't exist. You're crammed together with a dozen other men in a space the size of a modern bedroom closet. When someone rolls over, everyone rolls over. When someone gets sick, and someone always gets sick, you all get to share in the experience. Personal space is a luxury that went overboard before you even left port, and this is just your first hour aboard. You haven't even left the harbor yet, and already you're wondering if drowning might be preferable to whatever comes next. But the anchor is being raised, the sails are being unfurled, and your new life of maritime misery is just beginning. The worst part? You've signed up for this for years, not days. Medieval voyages weren't quick weekend trips. A journey from England to the Mediterranean could take months, depending on weather, pirates, and whether your navigator actually knew which direction was east. Some trading expeditions lasted over a year, and every single day of that time would be spent in these conditions with these men on this floating wooden hell. Welcome aboard. Try not to fall overboard before we cover what passes for breakfast. You wake up and I use that term loosely because actual sleep on a medieval ship is about as common as a hot bath. To the sound of the ship's bell clanging through the pre-dawn. Darkness, it's not a gentle wake-up call. It's the bosun's boot connecting with your ribs, accompanied by a string of curses that would make a tavern wench blush. The time is around 4 a.m., though timekeeping on a medieval ship is more art than science. They use sand timers that get turned every half hour, and the ship's boy, congratulations. That might be you, is responsible for turning them and calling out the time. Miss a turn or get the timing wrong, and you'll be getting acquainted with quaint. And with quaint, with quainted with. The cat o' nine tails before your second cup of, well, there is no second cup of anything good. Your body feels like it's been used as an anchor. The wooden deck has left permanent indentations in your spine. Your clothes are soaked through with a mixture of seawater and condensation. And you're pretty sure something small and many-legged scurried across your face during the night. Every muscle aches from the constant rolling and pitching of the ship. A motion that never stops, never eases, and will drive some men completely mad before the voyage is over. The temperature is whatever the ocean decides it should be, which is usually somewhere between uncomfortably cold and hypothermically freezing. Medieval ships had no heating system beyond body warmth, and maybe a small brazier in the stern castle that only the officers got to use. You huddle with the other crew. Members not out of affection, but out of desperate survival instinct. Shared body heat is often the only thing standing between you and death by exposure around you. Your shipmates are going through their own morning routines, if you can call them routines. There's no coffee, no breakfast waiting, no time to ease. Into the day. One man is coughing up blood, probably tuberculosis, but it might just be from breathing too much salt spray. Another is examining what looks like a festering wound on his arm, poking at it with a dirty finger and grimacing. A third is muttering prayers in a language you don't recognize, clutching a small wooden cross like his life depends on it, which it probably does. The ship itself is alive with sounds that would terrify you on land, but that you'll need to learn to interpret for your survival. The creaking of the hull tells you how much stress the ship is under. The whistling of wind through the rigging indicates changing weather. The slapping of waves against the bow reveals the sea's mood. Right now, all these sounds are telling you the same thing. You're in for a rough day above deck. You can hear the officers shouting orders to prepare for the day's sailing. The wind is picking up, which means the sails will need adjusting. The sails on a medieval cog are massive pieces of canvas that require dozens of men working in perfect coordination to manage. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and you could be crushed by a swinging boom or tangled in rigging and dragged overboard. But first, you need to address some basic human needs. Which brings us to one of the most horrifying aspects of shipboard: life sanitation, or rather, the complete absence thereof. Let's talk about what happens when nature calls on a medieval ship. Spoiler alert, nature doesn't call politely, and the ship doesn't answer with anything resembling dignity. Your bathroom is called the head, and it's located at the very front of the ship, the part that crashes through every wave and gets soaked. With every splash of seawater, it's just essentially a wooden box with a hole in it, suspended over the ocean. No walls, no privacy, no dignity. Just you, a hole, and the terrifying awareness that you're literally hanging your most vulnerable body parts over the endless ocean while the ship pitches and rolls. Beneath you, the process goes something like this. You make your way to the bow, clinging to whatever rope or rail you can find as the ship lurches. You position yourself over the hole carefully, because falling through would mean a very brief and very unpleasant swim in medieval maritime sewage. You do your business while praying to whatever gods might be listening that a large wave doesn't. Choose this moment to crash over the bow and give you an involuntary saltwater enema. Seize. Adventure on every horizon, the freedom of the open ocean. But let me tell you, the reality of medieval maritime life would have you begging to be thrown overboard by breakfast time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do. Here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But fair warning, by the end of this, you'll never look. And here's the really fun part. Everyone can see you. The helmsman, the lookouts, your fellow crew members. There's no privacy whatsoever. Medieval people weren't as squeamish about bodily functions as we are today. But that doesn't make the experience any less humiliating, especially when you're the new guy and everyone's taking bets on whether you'll fall through the hole or just fall off the ship entirely. Toilet paper. What's that? Use whatever's available. Old rope, rags, your hand, or just hope the seawater. Splash provides some natural cleansing. Most sailors develop a technique involving hanging over the side and letting the ocean do the washing for them. This works great until you realize that the ocean around your ship is probably contaminated with the waste of every other ship that's passed this way, plus whatever diseases are floating around in port cities upstream. For the officers, things are slightly better. They might have a private privy in the stern castle, though private is relative when it's separated from the crew quarters by nothing more than a thin wooden wall. The captain might even have a chamber pot in his cabin, though someone, probably you, will have to empty it overboard. But the real horror isn't just the lack of privacy or comfort. It's the hygiene implications. Medieval understanding of disease transmission was limited at best, and the connection between poor sanitation and illness wasn't well established. Ships were floating petri dishes of infectious diseases, and the primitive toilet facilities were major contributors to the problem. Dysentery was so common on long voyages that it was considered a normal part of the sailing experience. Crew members would develop bloody diarrhea that would last for weeks, leaving them weak, dehydrated, and often dead. The ship's head, with its lack of proper cleaning and its exposure to contaminated seawater, was a perfect breeding ground for the bacteria that cause these diseases. And then there's the smell. Oh, the smell. Medieval ships didn't have sewage treatment plants. Everything went directly into the ocean, where it would sometimes wash back up onto the ship during storms. The area around the head was perpetually soaked with a mixture of seawater and human waste, creating an aroma that would knock a modern person unconscious. Personal hygiene was equally challenging. Washing yourself meant using precious fresh water, which was strictly rationed, or seawater, which would leave you crusted with salt and even more uncomfortable than before. Most sailors simply didn't wash for the entire duration of the voyage. They'd develop layers of grime, salt, and bodily fluids that would become like a second skin, your clothes, assuming they survived the constant soaking and abuse, would become so filthy and salt-crusted that they'd literally stand up on their own. Many sailors would simply throw their clothes overboard when they became too disgusting to bear and go naked until they could acquire new garments in port. This was especially common in warmer climates, where the combination of filthy clothes and hot weather could lead to dangerous skin infections. And speaking of skin infections, the combination of poor hygiene, constant moisture, and abrasive saltwater created perfect conditions for a variety of unpleasant skin conditions. Boils, rashes, and open sores were so common that clear skin was a sign you hadn't been at sea very long. But don't worry, it gets worse. Because now it's time for breakfast. Breakfast on a medieval ship is an experience that will forever change your relationship with food, and not in a good way. The ship's cook, if you can dignify him with that title, is usually whatever crew member has proven too incompetent for rope work, but not quite incompetent enough to throw overboard. His qualifications consist primarily of still having most of his fingers and a willingness to work near open flame on a constantly moving wooden ship. Your dining room is wherever you can find space to squat on the deck, ideally somewhere that won't get you trampled by crew members working the rigging. There are no tables, no chairs, no plates, and definitely no napkins. You eat with your hands from a wooden bowl that you share with several other crew members, assuming the bowl hasn't been washed overboard during the last storm. The main course is hardtack, a type of biscuit that's been baked so thoroughly that it has the consistency of granite and roughly the same nutritional value. These biscuits are designed to last for months without spoiling, which they accomplish by being essentially inedible to begin with. You don't chew hardtack so much as you gnaw on it, like a particularly stubborn piece of wood. Most sailors learn to soak it in whatever liquid is available, water, ale, or even seawater, to soften it enough to avoid breaking their teeth. But here's the really appetizing part. Your hardtack is probably infested with weevils. These small beetles lay their eggs in grain, and the larvae hatch during storage, creating hardtack that's more protein than carbohydrate. Experienced sailors actually prefer weevily hardtack because the bugs eat the stalest parts first, leaving behind something slightly more digestible. The standard practice is to tap your biscuit against the deck to knock out as many bugs as possible. Then eat what remains. It's not uncommon to crunch down on something that definitely wasn't part of the original recipe. Your beverage is small ale, a weak beer that's safer to drink than water, but tastes like someone mixed pond scum with disappointment. It's stored in barrels that quickly develop a slimy coating on the inside, giving the ale a distinctive flavor that combines sour, moldy, and faintly putrid notes. The alcohol content is just high enough to kill some bacteria, but not high enough to make you forget where you are. If you're extraordinarily lucky, you might get some salted pork or beef. This meat has been preserved in brine for months, leaving it so salty that it will make your eyes water, and so tough that you'll need to boil it for hours just to make it chewable. The salt preservation process also gives the meat a gray color and a texture somewhere between leather and rubber. Many sailors describe it as salt junk, and they're not being affectionate. Fresh food is a distant memory that becomes more distant with each passing day. Any fruits or vegetables that were loaded at port quickly rot in the damp conditions below deck. After a few weeks at sea, you'll be lucky to find an onion that isn't completely black with rot. This lack of fresh food leads directly to one of the sailor's greatest enemies, scurvy. Scurvy starts subtly. Your gums become tender and begin to bleed when you eat. Then your teeth start to loosen and fall out. Your old wounds reopen spontaneously. Your joints ache constantly. You develop strange bruises that appear without any injury. In the advanced stages, you become too weak to work. Your personality changes dramatically, and you eventually die in agony. All from a lack of vitamin C, something that could be prevented with a single lime or orange. But fresh citrus is impossible to preserve on long voyages. So scurvy claims a significant percentage of every crew. The sight of shipmates slowly deteriorating from this disease becomes a constant reminder of your own likely fate. You watch strong men become walking skeletons. their teeth falling into their breakfast bowls, their legs too weak to carry them up the rigging. Water, when you can get it, tastes like the inside of the barrel it's been stored in for months. These barrels quickly develop algae, bacteria, and sometimes small animals that fall in and drown. The water becomes thick, green, and slimy, with chunks of unidentifiable matter floating in it. You learn to strain it through your teeth and try not to think too hard about what you're swallowing. Mealtimes are also exercises in social hierarchy and violence. The officers eat first and get the best portions. The experienced crew members get what's left. The new sailors like you get whatever scraps remain, if anything. Fighting over food is common and often bloody. A crust of bread can be worth more than a man's life. And here's the final insult. You're paying for this privilege. Medieval sailors often had to provide their own food or pay the ship's cook for meals. So you're literally buying the right to be slowly poisoned by rotten food and contaminated water. But don't fill up too much, because now it's time to work. And medieval shipwork makes coal mining look like a pleasant hobby. The bosun's whistle pierces the morning air like a banshee's scream, and suddenly your breakfast time is over. Not that you are enjoying it anyway. All hands on deck, he bellows. And you quickly learn that this isn't a suggestion. It's a command that could mean the difference between life and death, both for the ship and for you personally. Medieval? Sailing is backbreaking, dangerous work that requires constant attention and physical strength. The sails on a cog are massive sheets of canvas that catch not just wind, but rain, spray, and sometimes entire waves. When wet, they become exponentially heavier, and maneuvering them requires every available person pulling, pushing, and hauling with everything they've got. Your first job is probably working the lines, the ropes that control the sails. These aren't the neat, organized rigging systems you see in movies. They're a chaotic web of hemp rope, some as thick as your arm, all of it rough enough to strip the skin from your hands within hours. Medieval rope is made from hemp fibers that are twisted together without much concern for smoothness or comfort. Working with it is like grabbing handfuls of vegetable-based steel wool. The view from the top of the mast would be spectacular if you had time to appreciate it and weren't paralyzed with terror. But you're not up there for sightseeing. You're there to adjust sails, spot hazards, or act as a lookout for other ships. And you have to do all of this while clinging to rigging that sways back and forth, in arcs that can span 100 feet or more. Coming down is often worse than going up. Your arms are exhausted from working, your hands are numb from cold and rope burn. And you have to descend while the ship continues its relentless motion. Many sailors fall to their deaths during routine rigging work. Their bodies are usually lost to the sea, and their names are quickly forgotten as new crew members take their places. The officers, meanwhile, stand on the stern castle and shout. Orders that may or may not make sense, may or may not be physically possible, and may or may not be intended to kill you. Medieval ship officers were often former soldiers who understood discipline and hierarchy, but didn't necessarily understand sailing. They commanded through fear and violence, and questioning an order, even a stupid one, could result in flogging or worse. Weather changes everything about the work. And weather at sea is unpredictable and often violent. A calm morning can turn into a howling gale within minutes, transforming routine sail work into a desperate fight for survival. When storms hit, you'll find yourself working in conditions that would shut down any sane operation on land. Driving rain that feels like needles, winds that can knock you off your feet, and waves that crash over the deck with enough force to sweep away anything not securely fastened. During storms, sleep becomes impossible. Food preparation stops entirely. And the entire crew works in shifts around the clock to keep the ship from being torn apart or driven onto rocks. You might work for 48 hours straight, soaked to the skin, exhausted beyond endurance. with nothing to eat but soggy hardtack, and nothing to drink but ale that's been contaminated with seawater. And here's the really terrifying part. You're expected to do all of this work while learning an entirely new set of skills in a language you might not speak fluently, with tools you've never seen before, in conditions that would challenge even experienced sailors. Make too many mistakes, and you'll find yourself on the wrong end of the bosun's rope. Make a critical mistake, and you might kill yourself or your shipmates. The physical demands are crushing. Medieval sailors developed a distinctive appearance. Massive shoulders and arms from hauling rope, hands like leather gloves from rope burn, and a rolling gait from spending months learning to walk on a constantly moving deck. Many also developed hernias, back problems, and joint issues from the constant heavy lifting and awkward working positions. But the work isn't just physically demanding, it's mentally exhausting as well. You have to stay constantly alert for changing conditions, remember dozens of different procedures, and work effectively as part of a team even when you're exhausted, hungry, and terrified. One moment of inattention can result in injury or death, not just for you, but for your shipmates. And just when you think you're getting the hang of things, the weather changes or the ship changes course, or someone spots another sail on the horizon, and suddenly everything you thought you knew becomes irrelevant. Medieval sailing was a constant improvisation, requiring sailors to adapt quickly to new situations with limited information and even more limited options. But don't worry, it gets worse, because we haven't even talked about what happens when the weather really turns nasty. You thought the regular daily routine was bad? Wait until you experience your first real storm at sea. Medieval sailors had a saying, "Any fool can sail when the weather's fair, but it takes a sailor to handle a gale." You're about to find out which category you fall into. And the ocean doesn't grade on a curve. Storm clouds gather on the horizon like an approaching army. And the experienced sailors' faces turn grim. They know what's coming. The barometric pressure drops, causing headaches and joint pain in men who've been injured by previous storms. The wind starts to whistle through the rigging with an increasingly ominous tone. The waves begin to grow, transforming from gentle swells into towering walls of water that threaten to crush your tiny wooden world. The first drops of rain feel almost pleasant after days of salt spray and burning sun. But within minutes, that gentle rain becomes a driving deluge that soaks through your clothes in seconds and makes breathing difficult as water streams down your face and into your mouth and nose. The deck becomes slick as ice, and every step becomes a potential disaster. The captain orders all hands to secure for storm, which means everything on deck that isn't nailed down needs to be lashed down, stowed away, or thrown overboard. This includes you, if you can't find something solid to hold on to. The waves are now tall enough to crash over the deck, sending torrents of seawater cascading across the ship and carrying away anything in their path. Working in storm conditions is like trying to perform surgery while riding a bucking bronco in an earthquake. The ship doesn't just rock gently from side to side. It pitches forward and backward with enough violence to send grown men flying. Rolls so far to one side that you're sure it's going to capsize, and sometimes seems to drop out from under you entirely as it crashes through particularly large waves. The sails have to be reefed, partially lowered and secured to prevent them from being torn to shreds by the wind. This means sending men up into the rigging during the height of the storm, when the mast is whipping back and forth like a giant pendulum and the wind is trying to tear you loose and fling you into the churning sea. Many sailors simply refuse to go aloft in severe weather, preferring flogging to certain death. Those brave or foolish enough to climb the rigging during a storm work in conditions that defy description. The wind is so strong it can actually lift you off the rigging and hold you suspended in midair before slamming you back down. Rain and spray sting like buckshot. The ship's motion is so violent that you experience brief moments of weightlessness, followed by crushing G-forces as the mast whips in the opposite direction. Below deck isn't much safer. The cargo shifts with every roll of the ship, creating avalanches of barrels, crates, and loose goods that can crush anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. Water pours in through every gap in the hull, no matter how well caulked. The bilge. Pumps work constantly, manned by rotating crews who pump frantically to keep the ship from filling with water and sinking. The pumps themselves are primitive affairs, essentially large versions of the pumps used in wells, operated by hand and requiring constant physical effort. Pump duty during a storm is exhausting work performed in the worst possible conditions. Cramped quarters below deck, surrounded by shifting cargo. In water that might be knee-deep or higher, with the constant fear that the pumps might break or become clogged, top food preparation becomes impossible during severe weather. The galley fire has to be extinguished to prevent the ship from catching fire as burning coals scatter with each violent motion. This means cold meals, if meals happen at all. More often, the crew survives on whatever scraps they can grab, and choke down while clinging to whatever solid object they can find. Sleep is out of the question. Even if you could find a dry spot to lie down, which you can't, the ship's motion would make rest impossible. You spend the storm in a constant state of controlled panic, moving from one secure handhold to another, trying to stay useful while staying alive. Exhaustion builds up hour by hour, making every task more difficult and every decision more dangerous. The psychological impact of a severe storm is often worse than the physical demands. The noise is overwhelming, wind howling through the rigging, waves crashing against the hull, timbers creaking and groaning under stress, men shouting orders that are barely audible above the din. The ship feels like it's being torn apart by forces beyond human comprehension or control. Many sailors develop what we might now recognize as acute stress reactions during their first major storm. Some become catatonic with fear, unable to move or respond to orders. Others become manic, laughing hysterically while performing impossibly dangerous tasks. Still others become violently sick, not from seasickness, but from pure terror. And through it all, you're constantly aware that the ship could sink at any moment. Medieval ships were remarkably seaworthy for their time, but they were still wooden vessels held together with rope, tar, and prayer. Severe storms regularly claimed entire ships with all hands lost. When a ship went down in a storm, there were rarely any survivors to tell the tale. Even if the ship survives the storm intact, the aftermath brings its own challenges. Sails are torn and need extensive repair or replacement. Rigging is damaged and must be respliced or replaced entirely. Cargo has shifted and needs to be resecured. Men are injured and need medical attention that may not be available. And everyone is exhausted, hungry, and traumatized. But storms aren't the only weather-related danger. Fog can be equally deadly in its own way, reducing visibility to zero and making navigation impossible. Ships regularly collide with each other in fog or run aground on shores they never saw coming. Nice. Storms can coat the rigging with a layer of ice that makes it impossible to work with and heavy enough to affect the ship's stability. And then there's the calm periods when the wind dies. Get injured on a medieval ship and you'll quickly discover that the cure is often worse than the disease. The ship's surgeon, if there is one, is usually someone who's proven too incompetent for regular crew duties but shows a disturbing enthusiasm for sharp objects and other people's pain. His medical training consists of whatever folk remedies he picked up in port, plus a healthy dose of superstition and bloodletting. The ship's medical kit is a collection of implements that look more like torture devices than healing tools. Bone, saws with teeth like a shark's mouth, forceps that could double as pliers, needles the size of knitting needles for sewing up wounds, and the surgeon's favorite tool, the fleam, a sharp blade used for bloodletting that he'll apply to any ailment. From headaches to broken bones, got a cut. The surgeon will pour alcohol on it, not to disinfect it, since germ theory won't be invented for another few centuries, but because someone told him once that it helps. The alcohol is usually whatever rough spirits are available, often strong. Enough to strip paint and contaminate it with whatever was used to make it. The cure burns worse than the injury and often leads to worse infections than if you'd left the cut alone. Broken bone. Time for some medieval orthopedics. The surgeon will set the bone by feel, with no x-rays, no anesthesia, and no real understanding of how bones heal. He'll splint it with whatever wood is available, often pieces of the ship itself, and wrap it with cloth that's probably dirtier than the deck you were injured on. If you're lucky, the bone will heal crooked. If you're unlucky, it will become infected and require amputation. Speaking of amputation, it's the medieval surgeon's solution to most serious injuries. Infected wound, cut off the limb. Broken bone, that won't heal. Cut off the limb, suspicious rash. You guessed it, cut off the limb. The procedure is performed with a saw that's used for cutting rope and wood, on a table that's used for food preparation, with a tourniquet made from whatever rope is handy. There's no anesthesia beyond a leather strap to bite down on, and maybe some strong alcohol to drink beforehand. The patient is held down by whatever crew members can be spared from their duties, while the surgeon saws through bone, muscle, and sinew with all the finesse of a butcher preparing meat. The screaming can be heard throughout the ship and often continues for hours after the procedure. If you survive the amputation, and many don't, you'll be expected to return to duty as soon as possible. The ship can't afford to carry passengers, even passengers who are missing limbs due to the surgeon's enthusiasm. You'll need to learn to do your job with whatever appendages you have left, or risk being put ashore at the next port with no money and no prospects. Internal injuries are beyond the surgeon's ability to treat, so he falls back on medieval medicine's cure-all. Bloodletting. The theory is that illness is caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, and removing blood will restore the balance. In practice, bloodletting weakens already sick patients and often kills them faster than their original ailment would have. The surgeon might also try purging, forcing the patient to vomit or defecate through the use of various toxic substances. Mercury, antimony, and other heavy metals are common purgatives, and they're often more poisonous than whatever disease they're supposed to cure. Patients who survive the purging are often left with permanent damage to their kidneys, liver, and nervous system. Dental problems are handled with the same surgical finesse applied to other medical issues. Toothache. The tooth comes out, extracted with pliers while you're held down by your shipmates. There's no Novocaine, no antibiotics for the inevitable infection, and no concern for preserving nearby healthy teeth. The extraction often damages the jawbone and surrounding teeth, leading to more problems down the road. Diseases spread rapidly in the close quarters of a ship, and the surgeon's treatments often make them worse. Scurvy victims are bled, weakening them further. Sailors with dysentery are purged, dehydrating them even more. Men with fevers are wrapped in heavy blankets and placed near the galley fire, often dying of heat stroke before their fever breaks. The surgeon also serves as the ship's barber, which means he's responsible for cutting hair and shaving beards with the same tools he uses for surgery. This leads to the spread of infections and diseases through contaminated blades. A simple shave can result in serious skin infections that may require further treatment from the same surgeon who caused them. Mental illness is treated with a combination of physical restraint and violence. Sailors who crack under the stress of life at sea are chained below deck, beaten into submission, or sometimes thrown overboard as possessed by demons. There's no understanding of psychological trauma, depression, or anxiety, just the belief that madness is either divine punishment or demonic possession. Perhaps worst of all. The surgeon often experiments on the crew, trying new treatments. He's heard about in port or inventing his own based on his understanding of medieval medicine. These experiments are rarely successful and often fatal, but the surgeon continues them because dead patients can't complain about the results. And here's the final irony. You have to pay for this treatment. Medical care isn't provided by the ship. It's a service you purchase from the surgeon, assuming you survive long enough to pay the bill. Many sailors go into debt to pay for treatments that leave them worse off than when they started. But don't worry about medical expenses too much. Chances are good that disease will get you long before you need the surgeon's services. Disease on a medieval ship spreads faster than gossip and kills more efficiently than any storm. The combination of poor sanitation, contaminated food and water, close quarters, and weakened immune systems creates perfect conditions for every pathogen known to medieval medicine, plus a few that won't be discovered for centuries. Is your most likely companion on this voyage, also known as the bloody flux. It starts with stomach cramps and rapidly progresses to severe diarrhea that may contain blood and mucus. In the confines of a ship with limited access to clean water and no proper toilet facilities, dysentery spreads through the crew like wildfire. You'll spend days or weeks running to the head every few minutes, growing weaker and more dehydrated with each episode. The dehydration is what kills most dysentery victims. You lose fluids faster than you can replace them, especially when the only available water is contaminated with the same bacteria that caused the disease in the first place. Your skin becomes dry and papery. Your eyes sink into your skull, and your blood thickens until your heart struggles to pump it through your disc. Your body. Typhus is another shipboard favorite, spread by the lice that infest every crew member within days of leaving port. It starts with a high fever and severe headache, followed by a rash that begins on your trunk and spreads outward. The fever can reach levels that cause delirium and seizures. Many typhus victims die from the fever itself, while others succumb to secondary infections that their weakened immune systems can't fight off. Scurvy, as we've mentioned, is almost inevitable on long voyages. But the full progression of the disease is more horrifying than most people realize. It starts with fatigue and joint pain, symptoms that are easy to ignore when everyone on the ship is tired and sore. Then your gums begin to swell and bleed, and your breath develops a distinctive, sweet, rotten smell as scurvy progresses. Old wounds and healed broken bones begin to reopen spontaneously. Your teeth loosen and fall out. Strange bruises appear on your skin without any injury. Your personality changes. You become irritable, depressed, and paranoid. In the final stages, you become too weak to stand. Your wounds refuse to heal, and you eventually die from internal bleeding or infection. The psychological impact of watching your shipmates slowly deteriorate from scurvy is almost as devastating as the physical effects. Strong men become walking skeletons. Veterans of multiple voyages become helpless invalids. And you know that unless the ship reaches port soon, you'll be next. Smallpox, when it appears on a ship, is a death sentence for much of the crew. The disease spreads through respiratory droplets, meaning that simply breathing the same air as an infected person can transmit it. It starts with fever and body aches, followed by a rash that progresses to fluid-filled blisters covering the entire body. The blisters eventually scab over, leaving permanent scars on survivors, if there are any survivors. Cholera can kill within hours of the first symptoms appearing. It causes massive diarrhea and vomiting that can lead to fatal dehydration in less than a day. On a ship with limited medical resources and contaminated water supplies, cholera outbreaks can kill half the crew before anyone understands what's happening. Plague. The Black Death occasionally makes its way aboard ships through infected rats and fleas. Bubonic plague causes huge, painful swellings in the lymph nodes, followed by fever, chills, and often death within a week. Pneumonic plague, which affects the lungs, is even more deadly and spreads through coughing and sneezing. Ships arriving in port with plague aboard are often quarantined, or even burned with all hands still aboard to prevent the disease from spreading to the population on shore. But it's not just epidemic diseases that threaten your health. The constant dampness and poor living conditions create ideal environments for fungal infections that can affect your skin, lungs, and internal organs. Respiratory parasites are another constant companion. Intestinal worms are almost universal among sailors, causing malnutrition and weakness even when food is available. Lice not only spread typhus, but also cause constant itching and skin irritation. Fleas carry plague and other diseases while making sleep impossible with their constant biting. The ship's rats, present on every vessel, are vectors for multiple diseases and parasites. They contaminate food supplies with their droppings, spread disease through their fleas, and sometimes attack sleeping sailors, especially children or weakened adults. Rat bites can become seriously infected, and rats are known to gnaw on the toes and fingers of people who are too sick to defend themselves. Venereal diseases, contracted in ports, spread rapidly through the crew and cause long-term health problems that can make shipboard life even more miserable. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted infections were poorly understood and treated with mercury and other toxic substances that often caused more damage than the original disease. And perhaps worst of all, there's no concept of quarantine or isolation aboard a ship. Sick crew members continue to work until they physically cannot, spreading their diseases to everyone around them. The sick share sleeping quarters, workspaces, and eating areas with the healthy, ensuring that every disease spreads as widely and quickly as possible. Medical knowledge of the time attributed most diseases to bad air, curses, or divine punishment, so there was little effort to prevent transmission through hygiene or isolation. Treatments were more likely to weaken patients than cure them, and many diseases that are easily treatable today were death sentences in the medieval period. The mortality rate on long voyages could reach 50% or higher, meaning that half the crew that left port would never see home again. Disease was so common that ships often carried more crew than necessary at the start of a voyage, anticipating significant losses before reaching their destination. But even if disease doesn't kill you, there are plenty of other ways to die on a medieval ship. If disease doesn't get you, accidents will try their best to finish the job. Medieval ships are essentially floating death traps filled with sharp objects, heavy machinery, and structural hazards that can kill or maim you in creative and horrible ways. Safety regulations don't exist, protective equipment is unheard of, and workplace compensation consists of being thrown overboard if you can't work anymore. Falling from the rigging is probably the most common way to die, accidentally on a medieval ship. The rope ladders that lead up the mast are slippery when wet, which they always are, and there's nothing to catch you if you lose your grip. A fall from the top of the mast onto the deck below is usually instantly fatal, while a fall into the ocean gives you a few minutes to contemplate your poor life's choices before you drown. The ship doesn't stop to rescue sailors who fall overboard. During routine operations, turning a sailing ship around is a complex maneuver that takes time and favorable wind conditions. And by the time the ship could return to where you fell, you'd be long gone anyway. Your shipmates might throw you a rope if you're very close to the ship, but otherwise, they'll watch you disappear into the waves and continue with their duties. Even falls that aren't fatal can be crippling. Landing on deck from height often results in broken backs, crushed limbs, or head injuries that leave survivors permanently disabled, since the ship can't support disabled crew members. These lucky survivors are usually put ashore at the next port with no money and no prospects for survival. Being struck by the ship's rigging is another common accident. The massive wooden booms that support the sails swing back and forth with tremendous force, and anyone who gets in their way is likely to be knocked unconscious or killed instantly. The heavy ropes that control the sails can snap under tension, whipping across the deck like massive whips that can decapitate anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. During storms, loose cargo becomes a deadly hazard. Barrels, crates, and other heavy objects slide back and forth across the deck with each roll of the ship, crushing anyone who can't get out of the way fast enough. Below deck, improperly secured cargo can shift suddenly, creating avalanches of heavy objects that bury crew members alive. Fire is every sailor's worst nightmare. Medieval ships are made entirely of wood, tar, and rope, all highly flammable materials. The galley fire, oil lamps, and candles create constant fire hazards, and once a fire starts on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean, there's usually no way to put it out effectively. Sailors often have to choose between burning to death or jumping into the ocean to drown. The primitive firefighting equipment consists mainly of buckets of seawater and sand, which are largely ineffective against a serious fire. Ship's crews sometimes resort to cutting away burning sections of the ship with axes, essentially destroying the vessel to save what's left of it. More often, everyone abandons ship and hopes for rescue that rarely comes. Explosions can occur. When gunpowder is present on the ship, either for defense against pirates or for trading purposes, medieval gunpowder is unstable and can explode from static electricity, sparks, or even rough handling. A gunpowder explosion on a wooden ship usually destroys the entire vessel instantly, leaving no survivors. Being caught in the ship's anchor chain or rigging can crush or dismember sailors. The massive anchor weighs hundreds of pounds and is raised and lowered by human power using primitive winches and pulleys. The anchor slips while being raised. It can drag anyone attached to its chain into the ocean. If it falls while being lowered, it can crush anyone standing below. Tools and weapons on medieval ships are sharp, heavy, and dangerous. Axes used for cutting rope can easily cut off fingers or hands if mishandled. Knives used for splicing rope are sharp enough to cut through skin and bone. Mallets and hammers used for ship maintenance can crush skulls if they slip or are used carelessly. Hypothermia is a constant threat in cold climates. Sailors who fall into cold water rarely survive long enough to be rescued, even if the ship tries to turn around for them. The combination of heavy, waterlogged clothing and cold water quickly saps body heat and strength, leading to drowning even for strong swimmers. In warm climates, heat stroke can be equally deadly. The combination of physical labor, heavy clothing, and tropical sun can cause core body temperatures to rise to lethal levels without understanding of heat, illness, or effective treatments. Sailors often work until they collapse and die from hypothermia. Starvation becomes a real possibility. On long voyages, when food supplies run low or become contaminated, sailors might resort to eating rope, leather, or even each other to survive. Ships sometimes arrive in port with only a handful of survivors, all suffering from severe malnutrition and often driven mad by hunger. Thirst can kill even faster than hunger. When freshwater supplies become contaminated or run out entirely, sailors may try to drink seawater, which only accelerates dehydration and often causes delirium and death. Some ships carry distillation equipment, but it's primitive and often ineffective. Violence among crew members is another source of casualties. The stress of life at sea, combined with close quarters and diverse crews who may not share languages or cultures, often leads to fights that turn deadly. Sailors carry knives as tools, and disputes over food, work assignments, or personal conflicts can quickly escalate to violence, and sometimes death comes not from accident or disease, but from deliberate violence as punishment for perceived infractions. Discipline on a medieval ship is enforced through a system of punishments that would make a torturer blush. The captain has absolute authority over his crew, with the power to order punishments up to and including death. There's no appeals process, no jury of peers, no legal representation, just the captain's word as law, and his fists as enforcement. The most common punishment is flogging with the cat-o'-nines, a whip made of rope with 9 separate strands, each ending in a knot. The victim is tied to the mast or rigging and whipped across the back until the skin is shredded and blood flows freely. The number of lashes depends on the severity of the offense and the captain's mood, ranging from a dozen for minor infractions to over 100 for serious crimes. Flogging isn't just painful, it's potentially fatal. The whip can cut deep enough to damage muscles, ribs, and internal organs. Infections are common in the wounds, and many sailors die days or weeks after their punishment from sepsis or other complications. Those who survive often carry permanent scars and may have reduced mobility from damaged muscles and tendons. Keel hauling is reserved for the most serious offenses. The victim is tied to a rope that passes under the ship's keel, the bottom of the hull. He's then dragged under the ship from one side to the other, scraping against the barnacle-encrusted hull as he goes. The barnacles act like hundreds of razor blades, stripping flesh from bone as the victim is pulled through the water. Most keel-hauling victims drown before the punishment is complete. But those who survive often suffer from severe cuts, broken bones, and infections from the contaminated seawater and barnacle cuts. The punishment is designed to be a slow, agonizing death rather than a mere deterrent. And it's often performed in front of the entire crew as a warning to others. Marooning involves putting the offender ashore on a deserted island or hostile coast, with hanging is the most straightforward form of execution, though it's often bungled due to lack of proper equipment or expertise. Medieval ships don't carry professional executioners, so hangings are performed by whatever crew member the captain designates. The result is often a slow strangulation rather than the quick death that a properly performed hanging provides. Walking the plank, despite its popularity in pirate movies, was relatively rare in historical maritime punishment. Common was simply throwing the offender overboard, often weighted down with chains or anchors to ensure drowning. This had the advantage of being quick and not requiring any special equipment or preparation. Lesser punishments included being put in irons, chained below deck in the worst possible conditions, often in the bilge, where rats, waste, and contaminated water made survival unlikely. Victims might be left in irons for weeks, developing serious health problems from the restraints and unsanitary conditions. Ducking involved tying the victim to a rope and repeatedly dunking him in the ocean from the ship's side. While not usually fatal, it could cause drowning, hypothermia, or severe injuries if the victim was dragged against the ship's hull. It was often used as a mild punishment for minor offenses, though it could easily escalate to accidental death. Sailors could also be punished by having their food rations reduced or eliminated entirely. On a ship where food is already scarce and nutritionally inadequate, this punishment could quickly become a death sentence. Victims might be forced to watch their shipmates eat while they slowly starved, creating psychological torture to accompany the physical punishment. Branding was sometimes used to mark persistent offenders, with hot irons used to burn letters or symbols into the victim's skin. Common brands included T for thief, D for deserter, or M for mutineer. These permanent marks made it difficult for branded sailors to find work on other ships, effectively ending their maritime careers. Work punishments involved forcing offenders to perform the most dangerous and unpleasant tasks on the ship. This might include cleaning the bilge, the lowest part of the ship where wastewater and filth collect, working alone on dangerous rigging repairs, or handling the most hazardous cargo. These punishments often resulted in accidental deaths that allowed captains to eliminate problem. Crew members without formal execution. The arbitrary nature of maritime justice meant that Punishments could be inflicted for almost any reason that annoyed the captain or officers. Talking back, working too slowly, eating too much, sleeping at the wrong time, or simply being disliked could result in severe punishment. There was no consistency in how crimes were defined or punishments assigned. Fear of punishment was often more effective than the punishments themselves in maintaining discipline. Crew members lived in constant anxiety about inadvertently offending their superiors, leading to an atmosphere of terror that pervaded every aspect of shipboard life. This fear often drove sailors to desperate acts, including mutiny, which carried the death penalty if unsuccessful. And unsuccessful mutinies were far more common than successful ones, leading to some of the most brutal mass punishments in maritime history. When life becomes unbearable, desperate men sometimes choose desperate measures. Mutiny, the ultimate crime at sea, represents a crew's final attempt to escape intolerable conditions. But it's also the most dangerous gamble a sailor can make. Success might mean freedom and survival. Failure guarantees a death so horrific. It serves as a warning to future generations. Mutinies don't happen overnight. They begin with whispered conversations in dark corners of the ship, when exhausted men share their grievances against brutal officers, starvation, rations, or suicidal. Navigation decisions. The conspirators must be careful. Even discussing mutiny is a capital offense, and captains often have informants among the crew who report suspicious conversations in exchange for better treatment. The planning phase is fraught with danger. Mutineers must determine who they can trust when to strike, and how to overcome officers who are better armed and trained for combat. They must also decide what to do with loyal crew members and how to actually operate the ship once they've taken control. Many sailors know only their specific jobs and have no idea how to navigate or command a vessel. Most mutinies are doomed. From the start, officers sleep in easily defended quarters, often with weapons at hand. They typically have loyal followers among the crew who will fight against mutineers. And even if the mutineers succeed in taking the ship, they face the problem of what to do next. They can't return to any civilized port without facing execution, and they may lack the skills needed to survive at sea. When mutinies fail, the punishments are designed to be as public and brutal as possible. The ringleaders are usually hanged from the yardarm in front of the entire crew, but not before suffering extensive torture. They might be flogged until their backs are raw meat, have fingers or hands cut off, or be subjected to other creative punishments designed to make them examples. The hanging itself is often deliberately bungled to prolong suffering, instead of a quick drop that breaks the neck. Mutineers might be slowly strangled while dangling from the rigging. Their bodies are sometimes left hanging for days or weeks as a constant reminder to the rest of the crew of the consequences of rebellion. Lesser conspirators might face keel hauling, severe flogging, or marooning. Even sailors who weren't directly involved but failed to report the conspiracy can face punishment. The captain's goal is to create such terror that no one will ever consider mutiny again. And the punishments are designed accordingly. Some mutinies succeed in taking the ship, but then fall apart due to internal conflicts among the mutineers. Without the rigid hierarchy that normally governs ship operations, disagreements about leadership, navigation, and the distribution of resources can tear apart mutinous crews. Some successful mutinies end with the mutineers killing each other, leaving insufficient crew to operate the ship. Even successful mutineers face a grim future. They become pirates by default, since they can't return to legitimate society without facing execution. Piracy offers its own brutal lifestyle, with constant danger from naval forces, rival pirates, and the harsh realities of life outside civilized society. Many mutineers who escape their original ships die within months from violence, disease, or starvation. But mutiny isn't the only form of madness that can affect a ship's crew. The psychological pressures of maritime life regularly drive sailors insane, creating dangerous situations that can threaten the entire ship. The isolation and stress of long voyages can trigger various forms of mental illness. Some sailors develop paranoid delusions, becoming convinced that their shipmates are plotting against them or that the ship is haunted by supernatural forces. Others suffer from what we might now recognize as severe depression, becoming unable to work or care for themselves. Scurvy can cause psychological symptoms along with its physical effects. Advanced scurvy victims often become paranoid, aggressive, or delusional. They might refuse to eat what little food is available, become violent toward their shipmates, or attempt to jump overboard. Managing mentally ill crew members becomes a major challenge when medical understanding of mental illness is virtually non-existent. Some sailors develop obsessive behaviors related to their work or living conditions. They might spend hours performing meaningless, repetitive tasks, hoarding food or water even when supplies are adequate, or becoming fixated on perceived threats that don't exist. These behaviors can disrupt ship operations and create additional stress for the rest of the crew. Religious mania is another form of madness that appears on ships. Sailors might become convinced they're receiving divine visions, that the voyage is cursed, or that God is punishing the ship for the crew's sins. They might refuse to work on religious grounds, attempt to convert their shipmates through force, or engage in self-harm as penance for imagined sins. Sleep deprivation, which is common on ships due to watch schedules and poor sleeping conditions, can exacerbate mental health problems. Sailors who haven't slept properly for weeks may begin hallucinating, make dangerous errors in judgment, or become unable to distinguish between reality and dreams. This creates safety hazards for the entire crew. The treatment for mental illness at sea is usually more dangerous than the illness itself. Violent patients might be chained below deck, beaten into submission, or thrown overboard if they're considered too dangerous to manage. There's no understanding of mental health, just the belief that madness is either divine punishment or demonic possession. And through all of this, the violence, the madness, the constant threat of death, the ship continues its voyage toward a destination that seems impossibly far away. After months of suffering through disease, starvation, violence, and the constant threat of death, many sailors begin to view drowning as a merciful release rather than a fate to be feared. The ocean that surrounds your wooden prison starts to look less like a barrier and more like an escape. Root from endless misery. Death at sea is commonplace and unremarkable. Bodies go overboard with depressing regularity, wrapped in canvas shrouds, weighed down with shot or old iron. There's usually a brief ceremony, a few words from whoever can read, a prayer if someone remembers one, and then the splash as another crew member disappears beneath. So there you have it, a single day on a medieval ship, stretched across months of suffering that would break most modern people within hours. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak, but because the human body and mind weren't designed to endure the relentless brutality that was considered normal maritime life in the medieval period. The romantic image of sailing ships cutting through azure waters under billowing white sails is a myth created by people who never experienced the reality. The truth is, wooden prisons filled with disease, violence, starvation, and death, crewed by desperate men who had no better options and commanded by officers who ruled through fear and brutality. Medieval maritime life was so horrible that pirates' men who made their living through robbery and murder were often considered preferable employers to legitimate merchant captains. At least pirates shared their profits and offered some form of democracy in their operations. Legal maritime employment offered only suffering with no hope of reward. The technology existed to make maritime life somewhat more bearable, but economics and social attitudes prevented its implementation. Ship owners maximized profits by minimizing crew comfort, safety, and compensation. Sailors were viewed as expendable resources to be used up and replaced, not as human beings deserving of basic dignity and care. The legal system offered no protection. For sailors, maritime law was essentially whatever the captain said it was, with no appeals process or higher authority to which crew members.